December 1944. A cold wind sweeps across the Texas plains. A long train screeches to a halt near a small town no one in Germany has ever heard of. Hearne. Inside the boxcars sit dozens of young German women, nurses, clerks and auxiliary staff captured during the collapse of Nazi positions in France. They stare through the slats at a landscape that looks nothing like war. No ruins, no guards shouting in German, just vast open land and the smell of something unfamiliar. Soap. As the doors slide open, American MPs in clean uniforms call them out. No blows, no barking dogs, just a quiet order. The women, exhausted and wary, expect interrogation, maybe punishment. Instead, they're handed towels, told to line up, told to shower. The word shower hits them differently. For years, it had meant something else. Whispered horrors from the East. Gas. Death. Betrayal. But here, as they step into tiled rooms with running water and white soap bars, the scent of lavender fills the air. They freeze. No smoke, no guards shouting. Just steam rising gently. What these women found inside that American camp would dismantle everything they'd been taught about their enemy. By late 1944, the Third Reich was fracturing. Allied armies had pierced the Atlantic Wall. The Red Army was pressing from the east, and inside Germany, the civilian order was crumbling. Hitler's regime, desperate to fill ranks, had drafted thousands of women into auxiliary roles, communications, nursing, logistics, and clerical work. They wore uniforms, bore rank, and followed military discipline. Many never fired a shot, yet the war would brand them enemy personnel. When Allied forces advanced through France and Belgium, they captured not just frontline soldiers, but also female units from the Wehrmacht Helferinnen Corps, the German Women's Auxiliary Service. These women, trained to type orders or manage field hospitals, were swept up alongside generals, engineers, and infantry. Under the Geneva Convention, they were recognized as POWs, yet few expected their destination would be America. The United States, unlike Britain or the Soviet Union, had the capacity and confidence to bring prisoners overseas. By 1945, more than 425,000 German POWs were held across 700 camps scattered throughout the U.S., from the pine forests of Alabama to the deserts of Arizona. A smaller, lesser-known number included female prisoners, mostly nurses and auxiliaries, quietly shipped from Europe to fill repatriation quotas and to isolate them from ongoing conflict. Zones. These transfers were not acts of mercy. They were logistical operations. America had manpower shortages on farms and in factories. POW labor filled the gap. But the conditions the Germans found in Texas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma bore no resemblance to the propaganda they had been fed. Inside Nazi Germany, official broadcasts had painted the Americans as barbaric, gangsters of capitalism, a nation without discipline or moral order. Soldiers were warned, never surrender to the Americans. You will be tortured, starved, humiliated. For women, the warnings were worse. Tales of violation and vengeance by Allied troops. So when those German women stepped off the trains and saw white fences, open skies, and unarmed guards, confusion set in. There were no shackles, no dogs. The command tone was firm, not cruel. In the distance, they could hear the crack of baseball bats. Not rifle fire. Camp Hearne in Texas was one of the largest of these facilities, holding roughly 5,000 POWs, including several hundred auxiliaries transferred in late 1944. Life there operated on routine. Réveillé at dawn. Roll call, work detail, meals, lights out. But within those hours, an unexpected reality unfolded. A version of captivity that felt more civilized than the freedom they had known under the Reich's collapsing shadow. Each camp followed the war. Department's code of conduct for Prisoners of war. Geneva standards were not just met, they were exceeded. Every prisoner received adequate food, medical care, and the right to religious service. The U.S. Army even imported German-language books and instruments for camp orchestras. For many women, that first shower in America was the true moment of rupture. The point where Nazi indoctrination broke against the hard surface of American normalcy. Soap, clean water, and privacy were things many had gone without since the bombing of German cities. Here, they were routine. The symbolism was unavoidable. They had been told the enemy would dehumanize them. Instead, he restored their humanity through something as simple as hygiene. Behind the calm surface, however, the Americans had strategic motives. A clean, well-fed prisoner was less likely to resist, more likely to talk. Morale management was part of intelligence control. The War Department understood psychology, breaking myths without breaking bodies. Still, among the German women, unease persisted. They whispered that this civility must be an act, that punishment was only delayed. But days turned into weeks. Work assignments were organized, rations distributed, mail permitted. Slowly, the fear gave way to observation. The guards didn't wear ideology. They wore efficiency. Orders were followed not because of fanaticism, but because of discipline. For many POWs, this was their first glimpse of the difference between dictatorship and democracy. Power exercised through order, not terror. Inside those camps, something subtle began to shift. The prisoners' worldview cracked, and with every letter from home, each describing cities in ruins, families displaced, and an empire disintegrating, the reality of defeat became undeniable. But what would truly shake them wasn't the war's outcome. It was the quiet contrast between how America treated its enemies and how their own regime had treated its people. The journey to America was as surreal as the captivity itself. From ports like Le Havre and Southampton, German POWs were herded aboard Liberty ships and converted troop transports. The voyage across the Atlantic took anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, depending on weather and U-boat risk. Men and women were kept in separate sections, guarded but not abused. The contrast to what many feared was immediate. The guards offered rations, medical checks, and even cigarettes. The ocean was vast, silent, and unfamiliar. To the women who had grown up under Nazi discipline, every sunrise at sea felt like an unspoken question. What kind of enemy behaves like this? When they arrived in New York Harbor, the skyline appeared like something from another world. No bombed ruins, no blackout curtains, no rubble. The sight of intact bridges and busy docks left many in stunned silence. In their minds, the propaganda had already failed. From there, trains carried the prisoners inland under strict security. The journey through the American heartland, endless fields, orderly towns, neon-lit diners, exposed them to something no German newspaper had ever shown: the scale of American normalcy. No totalitarian grip, no fear, just systems that worked. By the time they reached the camps, many were emotionally disarmed. The women were typically classified as non-combatant POWs, a status that afforded slightly more leniency than combat troops. They were placed in barracks built for comfort, not punishment. Wooden structures with ventilation, bedding, and running water. Each barrack had showers, toilets, and laundry facilities, maintained to prevent disease. The War Department understood optics. American camps were meant to contrast sharply with Axis facilities. The U.S. wanted to prove, both to its citizens and the international community, that democracy could win wars without descending into barbarism. That policy wasn't altruism, it was strategy. Good treatment meant good intelligence. Prisoners who felt human were more likely to talk, to reveal production details, morale levels, or deployment orders. In the calculus of war, soap and civility were tools as powerful as weapons. For the German women, the first showers were almost ceremonial. In German cities, running water had been rationed, and hygiene collapsed under Allied bombing. Soap was scarce, rationed or replaced with coarse substitutes. But here, in a camp thousands of miles from home, there was abundance. Scented soap bars stamped U.S. Army, clean towels, and unpolluted water. Many later recalled the disbelief. The soap wasn't symbolic of luxury. It was proof that the world they'd been told to hate was more humane than the one they served. In letters home, heavily censored but preserved in archives, some wrote cautiously, "They treat us as if we were human beings. We have food, work, and even books. It is not what we were told." Those letters alarmed Nazi censors, who tried to suppress correspondence that could demoralize troops still fighting. But by 1945, the tide was irreversible. Daily life in the camps operated like a microcosm of order. Prisoners worked in canneries, cotton fields, and sawmills. They earned small stipends in camp currency, tokens redeemable at the commissary. They could buy postcards, cigarettes, even toiletries. It was a system of psychological control disguised as routine. Chaplains visited weekly. Red Cross inspectors audited conditions. The Americans made sure everything appeared, and often was, compliant with Geneva law. But not all prisoners saw this as kindness. Some believed it was moral manipulation. Among them, ideological officers warned, "Don't be fooled. The enemy softens you before he destroys you." The Nazi worldview clung to many like armor, fragile, cracked, but still worn. Still, time eroded conviction. As the months passed, rumors spread through the camps that Berlin had fallen, that Hitler was dead, that Germany itself no longer existed. When confirmation finally came through the camp radios in May 1945, silence fell. The war was over, but for these women, captivity remained. Repatriation would take months, even years. America now faced the task of managing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, including those who had begun, quietly, to admire the efficiency and dignity of their captors. Many would later say the shock wasn't in losing the war. It was in realizing how misled they'd been about their enemy. The United States had waged war through industrial power, but it had won moral ground through discipline. And in the coming months, those same principles, structure, order, and the strange civility of the American system would collide with the psychological scars of Germany's collapse. It was in that tension, between humiliation and respect, defeat and dignity, that the human story of the German women POWs would unfold. To understand why the German women POWs were shocked by something as ordinary as soap and a shower, we must dissect the story through multiple angles: human, ideological, logistical, and moral. The human contrast: war strips away humanity first and restores it last. When these women were captured, most had been raised under 12 years of relentless propaganda. They were taught that surrender meant degradation, that Americans were brutal, and that death was preferable to capture. The Reich's Ministry of Propaganda painted Allied forces as subhuman aggressors who would torture and defile any prisoner. So when the women were led into an American camp, clean, quiet, and structured, their mental armor fractured. The guards spoke calmly. Orders were given, not shouted. They were offered food, not as bait, but as policy. The first shower became a moment of dissonance. For many, it evoked trauma. The memory of gas chambers was a silent undercurrent, though none had personally seen one. The architecture of fear ran deep. Then came the moment, the sound of water, not gas, the smell of real soap, not industrial chemicals, the heat of the shower, not the chill of the camps back home. For a few, tears came quietly, not from comfort, but confusion. One Red Cross inspector in 1944 noted in his report from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, The prisoners appear in disbelief at their own conditions. They are healthy, fed, and clean. Some confess they did not think Americans capable of such restraint. It was a clash between indoctrination and reality, and the first crack in the ideological wall the Nazis had built, the ideological collapse. The Nazi regime sold its citizens a myth that the German was inherently superior and that surrender to inferiors was shameful. But here, thousands of miles away, that myth collapsed under fluorescent lights and American efficiency. In the camps, discipline remained, but not from fear. It came from structure, inspections, routines, meal schedules, all enforced by U.S. Army regulations. The Germans, accustomed to authoritarian order, found a strange comfort in the predictability. But the key difference was intent. In Germany, order existed to dominate. In America, it existed to maintain fairness. That realization struck deep. The guards, many of whom were barely 20, from Kansas or Ohio, treated them with professional detachment, not hate. To German women raised under the Nazi ethos of racial hierarchy, this reversal was disorienting. Some began to question everything they'd believed about the world outside Germany. Letters and diaries from POWs held in Texas and Oklahoma reveal the same refrain. We were told America was chaos, but this is order without cruelty. The ideological foundation of the Third Reich didn't crumble because of bombs. It eroded under the quiet consistency of American decency. The logistical machine behind that civility was industrial precision. By 1945, the United States held over 425,000 German POWs across 500 camps nationwide. Running those camps was a logistical operation as complex as a military campaign. Soap, showers, and sanitation weren't luxuries, they were logistical imperatives. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps ensured every prisoner received basic hygiene supplies to prevent disease outbreaks. Each camp had standardized plumbing systems, medical inspections, and sanitary inspections, not out of kindness, but because America's war machine couldn't afford inefficiency. Every item was tracked. Bars of soap, toothbrushes, towels, recorded as if they were ammunition. This wasn't charity. It was bureaucracy, elevated to moral optics. In showing the world that the U.S. could treat its enemies better than the Axis treated its own, Washington built a silent weapon: reputation. Reports of humane treatment spread fast through Europe, carried by letters and returning prisoners. By late 1944, even Wehrmacht officers privately admitted that American captivity was survivable, even enviable compared to Soviet capture. To the German women, however, the cleanliness of those camps wasn't just policy. It was psychological whiplash. They'd grown up in a system where obedience came from fear. In America, it came from process. And process, they realized, could be fair. The cultural shock for many German women. This was their first exposure to Western liberalism. Freedom of speech, open laughter, and gender equality in uniform. They saw American women working as clerks, nurses, even officers. That alone defied the Nazi worldview, where women were bearers of the race, not equals. In one camp in Louisiana, a captured German nurse reportedly said to a Red Cross worker, "You let women command men here?" The American woman replied, "Only when they're wrong." That anecdote, whether apocryphal or not, circulated through the camp like wildfire. It became a symbol of everything alien and secretly admired about the U.S. system. In Germany, propaganda painted American women as immoral, corrupt, and weak. In captivity, German POWs saw the opposite: confidence without arrogance, authority without cruelty. To the women prisoners, those showers with soap were more than hygiene. They were initiation into a new worldview. Clean water became the medium through which they realized civilization could exist without tyranny. America's humane treatment wasn't purely moral. It was also geopolitical foresight. U.S. policymakers knew that post-war Germany would need rebuilding, both physically and morally. Treating POWs well wasn't just about winning a war. It was about planting seeds for peace. By showing mercy, the U.S. demonstrated moral superiority, a weapon far more enduring than bombs. It laid the groundwork for the re-education of German minds, especially among the young and impressionable. Those women, in particular, would become witnesses when they returned, living proof that the enemy wasn't the monster they'd been told to fear. And when the first repatriations began in 1946, the letters they sent home, "We were treated with respect," did more to dismantle the myth of Nazi moral supremacy than any propaganda leaflet ever could. By the time 1945 ended, America had mastered the art of psychological warfare, not through deception, but through conduct, and inside those camps, surrounded by fences but treated with decency, thousands of German women began their slow internal transformation, from captives of ideology to witnesses of humanity. The psychological unraveling, what happened inside those camps, wasn't just a cultural adjustment. It was a psychological deconstruction. The women arrived with identities built on superiority, obedience, and fear. They left grappling with empathy, shame, and awakening. The U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division observed this transformation carefully. Reports from Camp Hearne and Camp Aliceville documented emotional fatigue among Nazi-loyal prisoners after prolonged exposure to American normalcy. Simply being treated well by the enemy became an existential crisis. In letters intercepted by the Office of Censorship, German nurses and auxiliaries wrote phrases like, "The Americans do not scream. They explain. We are beginning to feel human again." What propaganda had built in a decade collapsed in months. The dissonance between what they'd been told and what they saw every day, baseball games, friendly guards, music, coffee, soap, dismantled the regime's psychological hold. For some, it bred guilt. For others, quiet admiration. And in that fragile emotional space, a powerful truth took hold. Decency is disarming. The real victory wasn't military. It was moral. The American optics strategy, make no mistake, Washington knew exactly what it was doing. The Office of War Information, OWI, and the State Department were acutely aware that every German prisoner was a potential post-war storyteller. How they were treated could echo across Europe for decades. American officials leveraged this intentionally. They allowed Red Cross inspections, permitted German-language newsletters, and documented POW activities in photographs sent back home through neutral intermediaries. The goal was clear: showcase the American system as clean, lawful, and modern, the antithesis of totalitarian brutality. At a time when the Soviet Union's treatment of prisoners was notoriously harsh, U.S. policy drew a deliberate contrast. Humane treatment wasn't sentimental. It was a strategic message to the world. This is how a democracy wins wars. That image, German women calmly showering with soap, laughing nervously under real water, wasn't a cinematic metaphor. It was a calculated optic of civilization triumphing over ideology. Red Cross oversight and international law, the Geneva Convention of 1929 governed POW treatment, but few nations actually upheld it. The United States, however, enforced it rigorously, even extending rights beyond what the articles required. Every major POW camp was regularly inspected by the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. Their reports consistently praised American sanitation, nutrition, and medical standards. The Red Cross documented that each POW received soap rations weekly, typically 1 bar per man, or equivalent allocations for women's camps. Bathing was scheduled twice a week, more during summer. Latrines were disinfected, and delousing stations operated like hospitals, not punishment centers. In one report from Camp Huntsville, Texas, 1944, the inspector wrote, "The camp maintains high standards of hygiene. Prisoners appear clean and healthy. Facilities are equivalent to those of American soldiers. This wasn't just compliance, it was branding. America was showing the world that it could wage total war without abandoning total morality. And for the German women inside those fences, that care was both bewildering and convicting. Their own regime, the one that had promised a 1,000-year civilization, hadn't given them half as much humanity. The propaganda war within the camps inside, the barbed wire, ideological factions formed. Hardline Nazis saw American kindness as manipulation, a soft weapon meant to corrupt loyalty. They tried to maintain discipline, forbidding fraternization or English learning. But among younger prisoners, especially women, the resistance faded. Some began attending English classes organized by the U.S. Army. Others joined camp choirs, wrote poetry, or painted. Humanization was contagious. This terrified the Nazi loyalists. One female prisoner recalled after the war, "They called us weak because we smiled at our guards. But we had simply remembered that life could be normal. The U.S. didn't have to fight for their minds. It simply allowed them to think again." By 1945, thousands of POWs had quietly abandoned Nazi ideology, not through interrogation, but through exposure to decency. The showers, the food, the movies, they weren't trivial comforts. They were psychological weapons. Post-war repercussions after 1946, when the repatriations began, many of the returning women wrote testimonies that shocked their families. They described America not as a prison, but as a contradiction, a nation at war that still showed mercy. Their stories spread through ruined German towns faster than Allied propaganda leaflets ever could. One account, from a repatriated nurse, published in Der Spiegel in 1951, read, "We were treated not as beasts, but as people. I learned more about freedom in that camp than in all my years under the party." That single sentence captured the quiet American victory, the ideological conversion of a generation through simple, consistent humanity. The result was profound. When West Germany later aligned with the United States in the Cold War, the memory of those camps, clean, humane, disciplined, formed part of the psychological foundation for the alliance. The shower with soap, the calm guards, the fair treatment, they had become metaphors for civilization itself. The invisible symbolism, soap and water, two of the simplest substances on Earth. Yet in 1944, they became symbols of moral clarity. In Nazi-occupied Europe, those same words, soap, shower, had been twisted into euphemisms for industrial murder. In America, they reclaimed their original meaning: cleansing, renewal, dignity. Every prisoner who stepped under that warm water unknowingly participated in one of history's most powerful symbolic reversals. To the world, it proved that democracy could cleanse what tyranny had corrupted. And to the women who experienced it, the smell of lavender, the warmth, the silence. It was the moment they realized they'd been living inside a lie. By 1945, the war for territory was nearing its end, but the war for memory, for what the future would believe about civilization, was just beginning. And in that war, America's quiet decency had already won the first battle. Texas, April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing. The Allied front pushed across the Rhine, and in small camps scattered through Texas, America, the German women POWs were beginning to sense it. Not through gunfire or orders, but through silence, mail deliveries slowed. Guards whispered over radios. And one morning, the camp loudspeaker at Camp Hearne crackled. Germany has surrendered. No shouts, no songs, just quiet disbelief. Some women fell to their knees. Others simply stared at the horizon. For years, they had been trained to believe in the invincibility of the Reich. Now, that world was gone. And the only one standing before them was the same one that had given them soap, food, and music. That morning marked more than the end of a war. It was the emotional implosion of an entire ideology, witnessed in the most unlikely place, a POW shower block in Texas. The guards didn't gloat. Orders from Washington were clear. Maintain dignity. The war is over, not the humanity. So they continued their routines. Hot water still flowed. The prisoners still lined up for meals. The same American woman, a Red Cross volunteer named Helen Turner, still distributed soap bars with a polite smile. But that day, something shifted. When Helen handed a bar to one of the German women, a nurse from Bremen, the woman froze. Tears welled up. She muttered in broken English, "You still give us this? After we lost?" Helen nodded, confused. "Why wouldn't we?" That moment, small, quiet, almost invisible, captured the entire moral pivot of the war. The victor's power wasn't in cruelty. It was in restraint. Across dozens of camps, similar scenes unfolded. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, German prisoners requested permission to fly the white flag above the mess hall, symbolizing both surrender and mourning. The American commander, Major William Rice, approved it, but under one condition: they would raise it themselves, with their own hands as a sign of dignity, not defeat. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, women prisoners were gathered for a Red Cross announcement. They would soon begin repatriation processing. When told that they would be provided fresh uniforms, soap, and transport home with honor, several women broke down. For the first time, they weren't being told what to do by fear. They were being treated as individuals capable of choice. It was the turning point of perception, the moment when enemy became human being. In Europe, Hitler's propaganda machine had warned, "Americans will humiliate you. They are barbarians, capitalists, mongrels." Yet in America, these same barbarians were handing out towels and warm meals to their prisoners. For the U.S., this was not about charity. It was a strategic victory through example. By treating their captives better than the enemy treated its own citizens, the United States redefined what power meant in the modern age. It wasn't just tanks and bombers that won the war. It was credibility. Every German woman who walked out of those showers clean, fed, and alive carried an unspoken testimony. The enemy had a conscience. In the following weeks, as the camps prepared for closure, the emotional polarity inverted completely. Some women, now visibly healthier and more confident, began writing petitions to remain in America, citing fear of Soviet occupation, homelessness, or simply hope for a new life. Their requests rarely succeeded. Policy demanded repatriation, but each appeal was a moral signal. The United States had transformed its prisoners into believers in its system. At Camp Hearne, records show over 70 written requests by German women to stay on as civilian workers, nurses, or cooks. One letter read simply, "We have learned decency here. I want my children to grow where people smile." This was the true inflection point. The war that began with ideology ended with identity. Then came the inspection, the one that would immortalize the moment. In late May 1945, an international Red Cross delegate named Dr. Hans von Reuter visited multiple Texas POW camps for a final assessment. His notes, later archived in Geneva, stated, "The prisoners appear in good health and spirits. Their facilities are comparable to those of American personnel. Hygiene is exemplary. One is struck by the civility of their overseers." He included a single closing remark that historians still quote today. If the moral worth of a nation can be judged by how it treats its captives, then America stands tall. That sentence, penned by a neutral observer, crystallized what every prisoner had already begun to understand. By midsummer, trains began departing. Boxcars filled not with despair, but reflection. Some women carried photographs of their American guards, small keepsakes hidden in pockets. Others took the leftover bars of soap wrapped in cloth, a quiet reminder of a civilization they had once been told to hate. When the final convoy left Camp Hearne, the gates didn't clang shut with vengeance. They closed softly, almost ceremonially. One guard, Sergeant Daniel Ferris, wrote in his diary that evening, "Strange day. We sent home the enemy, and they waved goodbye." That line encapsulated the entire emotional inversion of the war. The victors didn't just conquer, they converted. And yet, as the dust settled, one deeper truth emerged. What America did inside those barbed wire fences became the most powerful propaganda of all. Not spoken, not printed, but lived. The shower with soap had started as an act of sanitation. It ended as an act of redemption. By late 1945, the narrative inside the camps had completely flipped. The women who had once whispered fearfully about enemy brutality were now organizing choir performances, crafting hand-sewn gifts, and volunteering to help clean infirmaries. The psychological reorientation was complete. To outside observers, it might have looked trivial. A few thousand POWs experiencing American kindness. But for those living it, the impact was tectonic. The walls that once separated conqueror and conquered had become classrooms of moral reversal. The women had entered captivity as ideological products of a collapsing Reich. They left as witnesses to a value system that could win a war without hatred. At Camp Hearne, one American chaplain recorded a scene that became emblematic of this shift. During Sunday service, he invited any prisoner who wished to pray for peace to join him. Slowly, tentatively, 4 German women stepped forward. One of them, a former Luftwaffe communications clerk named Elsa Kruger, began to cry as she prayed, in German, for the souls of those on both sides. No one interrupted. The guards stood in silence. Later, Elsa told the chaplain, "We were told that Americans had no God, that you fight only for money. But here I found grace." That statement, quiet and deeply human, marked the psychological capitulation of Nazi ideology more decisively than any tank battle ever could. Washington understood this implicitly. The U.S. War Department's Prisoner of War Division began to document these behaviors in official reports. One internal memo from late 1945 summarized, "Exposure to democratic order, humane treatment, and structured education programs within POW facilities has produced significant ideological shifts. Former adherents to National Socialist beliefs exhibit reorientation toward cooperative and moral norms." In other words, America was winning the peace before the peace had even begun. This wasn't just moral victory, it was strategic. A humane image would soften post-war German reconstruction and influence Cold War geopolitics. The soap and showers weren't just hygiene, they were policy, designed to demonstrate the ethical superiority of democracy over totalitarianism. The U.S. was consciously redefining warfare not as annihilation, but as transformation. At the same time, individual testimonies began to circulate. Some German women, upon returning home, shared their experiences, often to disbelief. One letter from a former POW, later published in a 1946 German Red Cross newsletter, read, "They gave us books. They gave us milk. They called us ladies. I thought it was a trap, but it was simply who they were." Others described the surreal contrast between captivity in America and devastation back home. While cities like Dresden and Hamburg lay in ashes, POWs in the U.S. had been painting murals, studying English, and writing journals. Historians now regard these accounts as vital to the rehumanization of Germany. The psychological reconstruction began not in the ruins of Berlin, but behind barbed wire in Texas, Alabama, and Wisconsin. The symbolic power of the shower persisted. Decades later, survivors recalled it vividly. One described her first day. "When the warm water came, I thought I would die from relief. I had imagined the gas. Instead, I smelled lavender. It broke something inside me, something the war had built." That sensory shock, fear dissolving into warmth, became a private metaphor for reconciliation. To them, the soap wasn't just cleanliness. It was proof that humanity had survived. By 1946, the last German women POWs were processed for return. Their departure was neither triumphant nor sorrowful. It was reflective. The American guards, many of them war veterans themselves, shook hands, offered cigarettes, and in some cases, hugs. There was no ceremony, just mutual acknowledgement. A few prisoners pressed small gifts into their hands, embroidered handkerchiefs, sketches, and folded notes. One such note, found decades later in the Hearne camp archives, read simply, "We came as your enemies. We leave as your witnesses." That single line distilled everything America's POW system had accomplished. For the U.S., it was a moral showcase that would echo into the emerging Cold War. The humane handling of POWs became an international benchmark. Soviet and British observers noted the same. America had managed to turn enemy captives into ambassadors of its values. And within a few years, when Germany began its slow resurrection as a democracy, many of those women, nurses, teachers, clerks, became mothers who raised their children on a new narrative of the world. That freedom did not come from obedience, but from conscience. Their sons and daughters would grow up in a West Germany aligned not by conquest, but by conviction. The chain reaction started with something as small and ordinary as soap. As historians later analyzed these camps, a clear pattern emerged. Every humanitarian act, the showers, the clean beds, the food rations, carried layered meaning. To the prisoners, it was survival. To the guards, it was discipline. To the world, it was a message. Civilization does not need cruelty to assert strength. The Germans had mastered the mechanics of war. The Americans had mastered the ethics of it. And in that moral high ground, the true turning point of World War II revealed itself, not on a battlefield, but inside a quiet camp shower, where steam rose gently around the faces of those who had once believed that compassion was weakness. The soap never ran out. The water kept flowing, and history, for a brief, improbable moment, was cleansed. When the last German POW ships sailed from New York Harbor in early 1946, few outside the War Department grasped the deeper significance of what had unfolded inside America's quiet network of camps. The headlines spoke of repatriation complete, but within the files of the Office of the Provost Marshal General, a subtler story was being archived, one of psychological transformation through humanity. The camps had processed nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners, among them several thousand women, nurses, clerks, auxiliary staff, fragments of a defeated empire. The paperwork recorded them as numbers, but, in truth, they had become living case studies in moral rehabilitation. Unlike Europe's ravaged facilities, the American POW system maintained meticulous standards. Nutrition, literacy, fair labor compensation, and strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. That consistency became its legacy. By the time they were released, the women who had entered the system indoctrinated under the Reich were leaving it speaking fluent English, with notebooks full of poems, sketches, and essays about democracy and dignity. Many returned home as unofficial emissaries of a new worldview. Germany, meanwhile, was in ruins. The women stepped off ships into a nation that barely existed. Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt were carcasses of brick and steel. Food was scarce. The mark was worthless. Millions were displaced. Yet these returning POWs carried something intangible, a memory of order, discipline, and civility that contrasted brutally with what they now saw around them. One returnee wrote in her diary, "In America, we stood in line for warm water. Here, we stand in line for bread. But there was dignity there, even for us, the defeated. That is what I miss most." That psychological comparison would quietly ripple through German post-war recovery. Sociologists later identified these returning POWs as catalysts for civic moderation, individuals who helped steer community values away from extremism and toward reconstruction. The American command structure had anticipated this. Internal memoranda from 1945 to 46 revealed that the War Department had deliberately used POW policy as a soft power weapon. The goal wasn't only to detain, but to reshape the moral infrastructure of the enemy. Colonel C. Ralph Hubner, an officer in charge of POW re-education programs, summarized it bluntly: "We cannot kill our way to peace. We can only educate our way to it." That statement became the ethical cornerstone of post-war American foreign policy, and the women's camps, though smaller in scale, were integral to that mission. Their treatment, humane, procedural, and consistent, was an operational demonstration that strength and compassion were not opposites, but tools of the same strategy. For many of the American Guards, it had also been a lesson. Most had entered the camps hardened by combat. Men from Normandy, the Bulge, or the Pacific. They expected hostility. What they found instead were scared, disoriented women trying to survive. Over time, mutual understanding replaced suspicion. One guard at Camp Aliceville later recalled, "They reminded me of my sister back home. Same age, same look in the eyes. That's when I stopped thinking of them as the enemy." By 1946, the emotional landscape of those camps had evolved beyond captivity. It had become something almost domestic, structured, predictable, human. The psychological dividends of that environment would pay off in the next decade, when Germany emerged as America's most trusted European ally. From a strategic perspective, the U.S. had accomplished three objectives simultaneously. Moral dominance. It contrasted its treatment of POWs against the brutality of Axis camps, reinforcing global credibility. Psychological reprogramming. It dismantled enemy ideology without propaganda, using exposure to humane systems instead. Diplomatic seeding. It sent home tens of thousands of future opinion leaders who would remember the U.S. not as conqueror, but as civilizer. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate form of moral engineering, the kind of long-range thinking that defined America's post-war success. And it all began in places most people never saw. Anonymous wooden barracks, guarded by tired men, where even a simple act like handing out a bar of soap became part of geopolitical reconstruction. Still, the story wasn't uniformly ideal. Some German women struggled to reconcile what they'd experienced with what they returned to. Many spoke of guilt for surviving comfortably while their families starved. Others faced hostility at home, accused of fraternizing with the enemy or forgetting their place. A few destroyed letters and photos from the camps to avoid suspicion, but others preserved them. Small tokens of decency from an enemy who had treated them as equals. Those artifacts would later become primary sources for historians studying the moral architecture of American captivity. In military history, the term victory usually refers to land gained or enemies destroyed. But in the quiet aftermath of 1945, victory had taken on a different shape: the capacity to rebuild the enemy without annihilating them. The Americans had demonstrated that civilization could be both firm and forgiving, and the women who had once entered their camps as prisoners had become the first living proof the legacy of that humane order would echo into the next generation, from the Marshall Plan to NATO, each built on the same foundational belief that decency is not a weakness, but a weapon. And in the post-war silence of a broken Europe, the echoes of running water and the faint scent of soap would linger, symbols of an empire's moral defeat and another's ethical ascendancy. When the final camp gates closed and the last roll call was logged, the physical remnants of the American POW system began to fade, but its psychological architecture remained, imprinted in reports, letters, and the minds of those who had passed through it. In the War Department archives, evaluations conducted by the Army's Psychological Warfare Division noted an unexpected outcome. Former German prisoners were becoming vocal advocates for democracy. Many wrote unsolicited letters to their American captors, expressing gratitude not for comfort, but for dignity. One letter from a German nurse, dated October 1946, read simply, "You treated us like human beings, and that was the first time I realized what freedom truly means." These personal correspondences, hundreds of them, became silent testimonies of a moral victory that no propaganda campaign could have achieved. Meanwhile, the German press of the late 1940s began publishing serialized memoirs of repatriated POWs. These articles, often titled with words like "Im Land der Feinde," wo ich Freiheit lernte, "In the Land of Enemies, where I learned freedom," spread quickly through the ruins of post-war Europe. Their narratives contrasted starkly with Soviet POW experiences, while German soldiers returning from the East carried stories of hunger, disease, and forced labor. Those from America returned with tales of baseball, libraries, and Sunday church bells. The propaganda advantage for the United States was enormous. Without spending a cent on leaflets or broadcasts, America had built a living network of human witnesses, each retelling, in their own way, a simple truth. The enemy had treated them better than their own regime ever did. In Washington, analysts recognized the significance. A classified report from 1947 described returning German POWs as involuntary cultural ambassadors, carrying American ideals into the heart of Reconstruction. The document emphasized that humane treatment had produced a self-propagating echo effect, where positive recollections multiplied far beyond the camps themselves. That echo became policy. It influenced the Marshall Plan's communication strategy, the tone of Allied occupation governance, and even early Cold War propaganda aimed at Eastern Europe. The message was clear. America conquers not only by force, but by fairness. That was the real weapon, invisible, ethical, and far-reaching. For the women who had lived through the system, life after repatriation often split in two directions. Some reintegrated quietly, marrying or working in the administrative skeletons of new West German offices. Others became educators, translators, or civic organizers. And yet, in interviews decades later, many still recalled the smell of soap, the warmth of a barrack stove, or the taste of American bread as defining memories of captivity. One former prisoner summarized it in a sentence that later appeared in a Red Cross report. "We entered the camp as soldiers of Hitler. We left as students of humanity." That transformation, understated but profound, was precisely what U.S. policymakers had hoped for. A reformation achieved not through ideology, but experience. In military terms, the POW program cost the U.S. taxpayer an estimated $150 million, but the strategic return was immeasurable. The nation had demonstrated to the world that victory could coexist with virtue. Every camp meal served, every humane regulation enforced, every respectful interaction, each was a microtransaction of soft power. And when those women returned home, they carried not just memories but comparisons. Comparisons that would later influence how West Germany rebuilt its social norms, its justice system, its governance, even its definition of dignity. By the 1950s, as Cold War lines hardened, historians began calling America's POW policy the quiet victory. It stood as a case, study in ethical warfare, a doctrine that sought to prove that discipline and decency could yield more enduring control than domination and cruelty ever could. The legacy even filtered into American military academies. At West Point and the Command and General Staff College, instructors referenced the WTPOW experience as a model for modern conflict ethics. The idea that moral restraint amplifies strategic credibility for the German women who once stood in line clutching soap bars. Unaware they were part of a geopolitical experiment, the consequences outlived them. Their stories resurfaced in documentaries, academic studies, and memoirs. Some even returned to the U.S. decades later. Tourists retracing the strange comfort of their captivity. At one reunion in Alabama in 1984, a former German POW nurse stood before an American flag and said, "You defeated us with decency. That's what history will remember." She was right, because beneath the steel and blood of the Second World War, beneath the numbers and dates, was a quiet, enduring truth that civilization isn't measured by how a nation wins wars, but by how it treats those who lose them. And in that measure, the United States had achieved something even the victors rarely do: a moral triumph disguised as hospitality. History often remembers wars through the sound of artillery and the silhouettes of advancing armies. Yet, in the quiet corners of captivity, another kind of victory was written. One without guns, one defined not by conquest, but by conduct. The story of the German women POWs who showered with soap in America isn't about comfort. It's about contrast between tyranny and tolerance, between ideology and integrity. These women, trained to believe they were superior, discovered humility through decency. In their moment of defeat, they saw a system that valued fairness over vengeance, and that realization was more shattering than any battlefield loss. In a war built on propaganda, the simple act of giving an enemy warm water and soap became revolutionary. It dismantled Nazi myths faster than any Allied broadcast could. Cleanliness turned symbolic, a purification not just of body, but of perspective. When those women left the camps, they carried with them something no army could confiscate: a first-hand understanding of freedom's true nature. That was America's quiet doctrine: strength without cruelty, power without hate. It was not perfect, but it was deliberate. By treating its enemies as humans, the United States achieved a strategic resonance that outlasted the war itself. Decades later, when these former prisoners told their children about the camp showers and the scent of American soap, they weren't recalling luxury. They were recalling revelation. The moment they realized that civilization wasn't who had the bigger army, but who had the bigger heart. Empires fade, battles end, but dignity endures. And in that endurance lies the real legacy of World War II's most overlooked victory. Not the destruction of an enemy, but the restoration of humanity. Because in the end, history's most powerful weapon wasn't a bomb, a tank, or a fighter plane. It was a bar of soap, offered by the victor to the vanquished with respect.